Obrigado, tan fine University of Porto. It's a real privilege to be part of this session today. This paper will address the career of Galway Dominican friar Nicholas Lynch, as well as the friar's ties to the city of Lisbon. Friar Nicholas Lynch died in 1633, and as such, Nicholas Lynch's career as an Irish Dominican coincided with a considerable Spanish influence over the Irish Dominican affairs. These ties between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Irish Dominican province proved vital to the survival and indeed the significant strides achieved by Irish Dominicans until the mid-17th century. From the mid-17th century onwards, however, the Irish Dominicans, similar to other elements within Irish Catholicism, became increasingly tied to the fortunes of the House of Stuart, particularly its Catholic members, which of course included Catherine of Braganza, the Queen Consort of England. And just by means of context, institutions formed for the education of Catholic clergy in Ireland were outlawed from the second half of the 16th, most of the 17th, and indeed much of the 18th centuries. As such, thousands of Irish migrants spent years on the European continent in colleges throughout Spain, France, Flanders, Italy, Poland and Portugal, as well as further afield before returning to Ireland as secular and regular priests. Regular clergy meaning Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, etc., and secular meaning diocesan or parochial priests. Writing about one such college, namely St. Patrick's Irish College in Lisbon, a foundation that I understand Louisa was going to talk about. Yes. This foundation trained Irish secular diocesan priests and first opened its doors circa 1590. Professor Cullen Lennon recently pointed out that, and I quote, the debt of the Irish Catholic Church to those patrons, mostly of Portuguese origin, who in their magnanimity conferred generous gifts on the fledgling Institute of St. Patrick's at Lisbon, out of genuine concern for the well-being of Catholicism in Ireland, is enormous, end quote. Professor Lennon went on to argue that the city of Lisbon had offered a kind of beneficent heritage, which he saw as becoming manifest in the Irish Counter-Reformation itself. Lisbon was not only the location of the aforementioned St. Patrick's College, however, but also became a considerable centre for the training of Irish Dominican friars, with Corpus Santos Foundation in 1632. The monastery of Our Lady of Bon Sucesso for Irish Dominican nuns was soon after also opened by 1639, and that community closed about 2 years ago, I think. But prior to the second half of the 17th century, most Irish Dominicans preparing to return back to Ireland did so having received their education in various Dominican convents throughout Spain. Hibernica Dominicana, or the Irish Dominicans, were to a large extent heavily financed by the Spanish Habsburgs, in as far as many returning Irish Dominicans had not only been educated in Spanish convents, but likewise received a viaticum from the kings of Spain that financed their travel expenses home back to Ireland. From the early decades of the 1600s, most Dominicans returning to the Irish mission, however, did so from the port of Lisbon. In 1634, the papal legate at Lisbon wrote of how he had noticed a constant stream of Irish Dominicans returning to Ireland out of the city's port. Quote, many missionaries, he wrote to Pope Urban VIII, particularly Dominicans, leave here daily. The Irish Dominicans have overcome the greatest difficulties, began a hospice here in Lisbon 2 years ago, to which are brought all the priests of that order, who study in different convents and universities of Spain. On becoming theologians and priests, they return to their homeland to preach the gospel. Now, one more point of clarification before I continue with this paper. The Irish Franciscans also maintained strong links to the Spanish Habsburgs, but were not as closely aligned after 1610 as the Irish Dominicans continued to be. The Dominicans, no less than the Franciscans of Ireland, had traditionally attracted many of its membership from the Gaelic Irish, or the so-called Old Irish population, Gaelic Irish essentially denotes the indigenous population of Ireland that predated the Norman invasions of the 1200s. My own surname, for instance, is of Old Irish Gaelic origin, as are most surnames in Ireland to this day. The essential point that I'm labouring to make here, however, is that the Irish Dominicans' fortunes were intrinsically bound to Spain up until the mid-17th century mark. From about 1590 to 1645, most Dominicans that returned to Ireland as Dominican priests received their religious preparation in Dominican convents at Valladolid, Burgos, Seville, Valencia, Bilbao and Salamanca, as well as a host of other Spanish Dominican centres. What turned out to be the catastrophe of the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, the Irish Catholic cause in the 1650s, changed everything, however. The Cromwellian parliamentarians were Puritan militant Protestants who, having won the English Civil War, turned their attention to what many of their numbers considered heretical Papists or Catholic Ireland. The decade or so of armed conflict in Ireland that culminated in the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland has been estimated as resulting in the loss of over 40% of the population of the country, or about 620,000 lives. Now, prior to the Cromwellian invasion, however, and as Portugal began attempting to separate from Spain and the Iberian Union, Fray Dominic, or Daniel O'Daly, had switched his allegiance from the Spanish Habsburgs in the 1630s to that of the House of Braganza. Fray Dominic O'Daly is the man largely credited with the foundation of Corpus Santo at Lisbon, but his transference of allegiance amounted to transferring his allegiance from what was the Spanish orbit of the Irish Dominicans to that of his own promotion of an alliance between Portugal, France, England and Sweden. By doing so, as historian Tom O'Connor has pointed out, O'Daly's room for manoeuvre on behalf of Ireland was greatly limited, and he perhaps might be best seen from this time on as a Portuguese diplomat who happened to be Irish. She was particularly his period of agency for the Braganzas during the restoration of the Portuguese monarchy. Prior to the Cromwellian invasion, however, and as Portugal began attempting to separate from Spain, Nevertheless, with the foundation of the Irish Dominican College of the Holy Cross at Louvain in 1615 and the later foundation of Corpus Santo in Lisbon in the 1630s, and indeed the subsequently founded Irish Dominican College based at San Sisto e Clemente at Rome, Irish Dominicans increasingly opted to study at one of these three Irish convents. The House of Braganza proved instrumental not only in the establishment of Corpus Santo as a seminary for the Irish Dominican province at Lisbon in the 1630s, but likewise proved a vital ally in the Irish friars' successful bid for their houses at Rome decades later. The intervention of Catherine of Braganza on behalf of the Irish friars being largely seen as proving pivotal to the friars' successful acquisition of their Roman houses in the 1670s. Catherine's mother, the Queen Consort of Portugal, Luisa de Guzman, certainly proved no less a great benefactor of the Irish Dominican friars, as well indeed as a benefactor of the Irish nuns of Concession at the line. It's perhaps important to remain mindful here that the concept of religious inheritance was particularly important for mendicant orders like Dominicans and Franciscans in the 17th century. So this stands to reason more recent Catholic religious entities like the Jesuits, no less than the Calvinists or the Lutherans in the Protestant or Reformed tradition, can and were projected as recent products of the Reformation period, in comparison to the mendicants' much older contribution and position in Western Europe's Christian heritage. Polish Dominicans, for instance, were never shy in dismissing their Jesuit co-religionists as New Catholics, a term that was meant to be intentionally uncomplimentary. Lineage, pedigree and continuity mattered in the Dominican and Franciscan traditions because such notions tended to highlight these older orders as custodians, if not living embodiments, of the Western Christian tradition itself, a tradition that predated the recent Reformation's byproducts, that in a real sense were portrayed as complicating and crowding the religious marketplace at the times. Orders like the Dominicans and Franciscans, therefore, were claiming to possess a particular position in Europe's religious inheritance. The House of Braganza was perhaps no different in this respect, and the Portuguese Queen Regent, Luísa de Guzmán, as Margaret McCurtain has pointed out, not only, quote, proved a generous benefactor, but likewise took an active role in the affairs of the Dominican order in Portugal, on account of the Queen's belief that she came from the same stock as the Dominican order's patriarch, St. Dominic de Guzmán. The interest she displayed in her familial connections to St. Dominic may indeed have been encouraged by Fray Dominic O'Daly, as O'Daly was a noted genealogist himself. Indeed, various branches of his O'Dalys had provided many of the most celebrated genealogists in Ireland for centuries. Luísa de Guzmán's immediate predecessors had cultivated far closer ties with the Franciscan order, and indeed it seems that it was with Luísa that the closer bonds were again forged between the House of de Guzmán and the Order of St. Dominic de Guzmán, after a century or so of preferred patronage to the Franciscan order by her immediate de Guzmán forebears. In Luísa de Guzmán's native Spain, the Order of Friars Preachers, or Dominicans, had been the mendicant order most closely connected to the Spanish aristocracy since the time of St. Dominic himself. Each of Philip III's confessors, like those of his predecessors and Spanish Habsburg successors, were all Dominicans. Dominican influence over the Spanish monarchy was notably substantial. None of Philip II's financial decisions, for instance, were made without first ensuring that they could be justified in good conscience with his Dominican confessor, a role that historian George Parker has described as the Spanish king's religious springboard. Helen Rawling has pointed out that the Dominican monopoly over the royal confessorship in Spain since 1218 had given the Dominican order intimate access to the royal conscience, making the Dominican confessor the most trusted personal advisor to the Spanish king, next to the favourite. Now, most of my current research concerns 17th century Dominicans from the western province of Ireland, Connacht, in which the city of Galway is situated. There are 4 provinces in Ireland: Connacht to the west, Munster to the south, Leinster in the east, and Ulster to the north of the country. The Friars Preachers, or Dominicans in Ireland, had enjoyed deep-seated attachments to the country's aristocracy almost since their first foundation in 1221. Familial attachments that have been generationally maintained and were crucial throughout the 17th century, not only in terms of continued patronage by such families, but in terms of many members of the same family supplying many of the leading friars of the order, which became particularly the case as the 17th century progressed and the fortunes of these Irish families became increasingly under threat. Born in 1590, the future Dominican friar Nicholas Lynch was the youngest of 7 sons and belonged to a family, the Lynches, that had fostered extensive business trade with the major ports of the European continent for centuries. The Lynches had acted as the most important group of what had effectively been an oligarchy of families known as the merchant tribes of Galway, who had ruled their western citadel and likewise governed its trade since the 14th century. Urban historian Matthew Potter has recently pointed out that, and I quote, "Urban areas of Europe were usually ruled by small exclusive elites, and Ireland was no exception. If the elaborate constitution and spectacular success of Venice epitomised the great oligarchies of the continent, the celebrated 14 tribes who monopolised the government of Galway until the 1650s represented the archetype of Irish urban government." End quote. So, just to go back a little bit, by 1484, a predecessor of Fry Nicholas Lynch, named Dominic Lynch, had successfully achieved papal recognition from Rome to make Galway City an ecclesiastically independent entity. The same Dominic Lynch also successfully achieving the then town being granted city status in 1484. The same year, he also invited the Dominicans to make their foundation in his native city. Between the period Galway became a city in 1484 until the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 1650s, the majority of Galway's mayors continued to be members of the Lynch family. Now, Ireland at the time of Fry Nicholas' birth in 1590 was still, however, an overwhelmingly rural country of about 1 million people. The two most populated cities at the time of the friar's birth had been Dublin in the east and Galway in the west, with the former, Dublin, containing a mere 5,000 inhabitants, and the latter, Galway, containing something slightly more than 4,000 souls. Dublin was the administrative capital of Ireland, whereas Galway continued to maintain its traditional trading links with the rest of Europe by exporting agricultural produce from its surrounding rural hinterland and importing wines and various other products. About 10 years before Nicholas's birth, however, Mass, Missa, ceased to be said in St. Nicholas's Church, a building that had acted as the ecclesiastic centre for the merchants of the town, and the place where most of the more prominent lynches were buried. The adoption of Protestant services in major churches in cities like Galway and Dublin, as well as other Irish towns, reflected the growing consolidation the English, by then Protestant crown, had achieved in Ireland over the previous decades. By the time of Fry Nicholas's birth, however, the ruling families of Galway remained Catholic and had, like Nicholas's father, ceased attending all religious services at St. Nicholas Church, which were now Protestant. And likewise, like the friar's father had done, these merchants ceased paying for the upkeep of the church that their ancestors had so richly endowed. This situation was replicated almost throughout Ireland in as far as countrywide in both rural and urban areas. Catholicism essentially remained the overwhelming religion of the country's population. Now, the reasons why Ireland remained so Catholic have been the topic of heated debate for generations of Irish historians. Prima facie, Ireland should have followed the same route as the rest of Europe. Indeed, with a few exceptions, most regions in Europe follow the diktat of the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, cuius regio, eius religio. That is to say, whatever the religion of the monarch or ruler of a region, and so too invariably went their subjects' religious practice. As such, Spain, France, and Italy were ruled by Catholics, and in turn these countries' populations followed suit. The German and Austrian regions under Habsburg hegemony remained Catholic, whereas in the regions of Germany ruled by Lutheran rulers, the general population in turn practiced Lutheranism. Similarly, under other Protestant monarchies such as Sweden and Denmark, these countries' population followed the religion of their kings. The Swiss were either Catholic or Calvinist, depending on the religion of the ruler of a particular region. The parts of Bohemia that had adopted Protestantism were forcefully reverted back to Catholicism when the Northern Habsburgs regained control over what constitutes much of present-day Czech Republic. This, of course, would have disastrous consequences for how organised religion was subsequently perceived in this part of Central Europe. But this same process, however, proved unsuccessful in Ireland. As mentioned already, the English Protestant crown had been consolidating its grip over Ireland, particularly since the latter half of the 16th century. Nevertheless, Ireland's population, unlike that of England's population, had become intransigently, if not intrinsically, more Catholic since the Reformation began. Again, why this was the case has remained a source of much and heated debate in Irish historiography. For decades, many historians posed the question why the Protestant Reformation had been such an abject failure in Ireland. But more recent scholarship, however, has approached the question from the other side of the bridge, so to speak, in as far as recent scholarship has laid a much greater emphasis on why and how Catholicism was so successfully maintained in Ireland. But if we take the birth of Nicholas Lynch in 1590 as our starting point, virtually all of the inhabitants of Ireland, north, south, east and west, were either of Old Irish, Gaelic descent, or descendants of Anglo-Normans, or a mixture of both, with the vast bulk of this, the country's inhabitants, also being Catholic, as well as overwhelmingly Irish-speaking. With few exceptions, virtually all of the Irish aristocracy, or higher orders, as they're called, remained Catholic. The vast bulk of what you might describe as middle-class urban Ireland was likewise Catholic, as were virtually all of the so-called lower orders of the country. This contrasts dramatically with what was, by 1590, an increasingly Protestant Britain. As already highlighted, regarding the western region of Connacht, the main focus of my own research, the Dominican order had been the most important mendicant order since their arrival in the 1200s. The Franciscans were also numerous in Connacht, however. However, it is fair to say that the Dominicans had enjoyed a more deep-seated attachment to the principal families of the region, as well as enjoying similarly deep-seated bonds with the region's lower orders. The most powerful family in southern Connacht, the Clonrickard de Burgos, the Norman family, had provided generations of friars to Athenry Priory, Dominican Priory, where the ruling head of the family, Clonrickard, had also been traditionally buried for centuries. Likewise, the most powerful family in what is now Mayo, to the east of the region, had similarly provided generations of friars to the Dominican Abbey of Burshul, where the head of that household was also buried with the friars. Roscommon Abbey, to the east of Connacht, was founded by the O'Connors of Don, the descendants of the last kings of Ireland, circa 1250. And indeed, their related family of O'Connors Sligo, in the northern part of Connacht, had likewise been the principal patrons to the Dominican Abbey at Sligo since the late 1200s. And each of these households also provided generations of friars to such priories, a tradition maintained throughout the 17th century and beyond. Now, much of the rest of the Connacht, or the west of Ireland, was dominated by smaller families, with many of these families attached to the Dominican Priory located in their specific region. As previously highlighted, most of the inhabitants of Connacht lived in the rural countryside. However, by the turn of the 17th century, many of the principal merchant families of Galway City became also increasingly attached to the Dominican order, mirroring the culture of the surrounding Connacht society in this respect. Born in Galway, Nicholas Lynch's family belonged to the most powerful merchant family of Galway City, whose various branches had conducted extensive trade with the continent for centuries, between Galway and the city of Lisbon. And indeed, Nicholas spent most of his youth in his family's adopted Portuguese town. His father, also Nicholas Lynch, was likewise educated in Lisbon, as indeed were all of Nicholas's 7 brothers, with the exception of his eldest male sibling, Henry Lynch. The friar's father had been a former mayor of Galway, as indeed his brother, Thomas Lynch, would likewise become by the 1620s. This mayor, Thomas Lynch, had studied to be a physician in Lisbon and was qualified by the first decade of the 17th century. But by the age of 25, his youngest brother, Nicholas, entered St. Patrick's College at Lisbon. Months later, however, Nicholas decided against becoming a secular priest and instead took the habit of the Dominican order at Salamanca. By the time Nicholas Lynch entered St. Stephen's Dominican Studium at Salamanca, he was one of 4 natives of Galway City in 1615 that came from the ruling merchant families of the town, who were studying to be Dominicans at the famed St. Stephen's at Salamanca. 3 of these friars were also Lynches. Following his years of training on the continent, Nicholas Lynch, OP, returned to his native Galway in time for the meeting of Connacht Catholic clergy in May of 1624. His arrival in Galway was duly noted by the Protestant authorities, but so too was his relationship to his then powerful brother, Henry Lynch. Catholics in Ireland were by the 1620s regaining much of their power. By the time of Fry Nicholas's return to Galway, he was being described by Protestant authorities as the leading Dominican in Ireland, and a friar that commanded immense respect from the general population. The Protestant authorities, however, could do very little about his presence, or rather, they did not have the manpower to apprehend the much lauded friar preacher on his return. Nicholas's return to Ireland had been financed by Philip III of Spain. Indeed, within a year of his return, the friar's brother, and similarly Lisbon-educated Thomas Lynch, was elected mayor of the city of Galway. The same year as Thomas Lynch was mayor, the city signed an agreement with the Dominicans, giving the order sole authority over all educational bodies in the town of Galway. The final document of the agreement between the Corporation of Galway and the Galway Dominicans concerning the city becoming a kind of Dominican college town is dated to September the 20th, 1626, and signed by the then prior Fry Nicholas Lynch, as well as Fry Stephen Lynch and Friar Dominic Lynch and Friar Peter Martin. The prior's brother, Mayor Thomas Lynch, also signed the same document on behalf of the corporation, which established the special status of Dominican colleges in the town. Courses under the stewardship of the Galway Dominicans were to include the humanities, the liberal arts and theology. Sir Henry Lynch, Friar Lynch's eldest brother, contributed £300 towards the building of one of these colleges. But Nicholas Lynch's return to Galway from Lisbon might be seen as having contributed significant. Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay, I'm sorry. Along with his position as one of the 4 Dominican Masters of Education in Galway, Fry Nicholas Lynch is also credited as having been, quote, the restorer of the Rosary in Galway City, a devotion Fry Nicholas was also heralded as having successfully promoted throughout Ireland. But just a brief note about the considerable cultural effects of the Rosary on Irish society. The Rosary in Irish Catholicism from the 17th century onwards became an integral part of the population's everyday practices. During the 17th century, the most common name for the Dominican friars became Acrat na Padre, which translates from Irish as the Fathers of the Rosary. The Rosary's cultural impact on Ireland was profound, and by the 18th and 19th century might be seen as a cultural and anthropological aspect of the everyday culture, as it was from a religious point of view. I'm not sure about what the procedure is in Portugal, but even amongst non-religious families in the increasingly secular Ireland of today, most Irish Catholics have the Rosary said while a given person is dying or in the process of getting dead, as it were. The Rosary is also said as part of the rites of the removal of the dead in Ireland. And the process of being buried in contemporary Irish church is also accompanied with a Rosary being said as the coffin is being lowered into the ground. But Nicholas Lynch's return to Ireland from Lisbon might be seen as having contributed significantly to this hugely significant development in Irish culture, which was soon after to become such an integral and transformative part of Irish Catholic identity. The propagation and cultivation of Rosary devotion by Fry Nicholas and other such Dominicans coming back from the continent became a central component for groups of laity associated with the Dominican order. And Winston Allen has argued that Rosary organisations offered a way to escape the control of the secular clergy, at least in locations where members of the sponsoring Dominicans served as chaplains and confessors. Such Dominican groups have also been seen as gaining a notable recruitment of women, particularly the case concerning Dominican lay groups associated with the devotion to the Rosary. When Nicholas Lynch was reared and educated in Lisbon, as well as Spain, the Rosary group that Fry Nicholas founded in the city of Galway in around 1624 has been noted as the embryonic beginnings of the Dominican monastery of nuns that were later formed in Galway circa 1642. An incident of an image of the Rosary altar frontal from this convent, and obviously it's Iberian influences. By the 1630s, Dominicans in Ireland seem to have been decisively cornering the Mariology market. Many of the country's population saw the Dominicans as possessing an almost direct line, so to speak, with the Blessed Virgin. Indeed, complaints have been lodged to Propaganda Fide by other regular orders. By 1631, the friars preachers, Dominicans, have been claiming to be the Blessed Virgin Mary's very own order, which presented obvious difficulties to friars of other orders questing for their upkeep. As mendicants, the Irish Dominicans relied on begging from the population for their financial upkeep, which was likewise the case for Franciscan, Augustinian and Carmelite friars. The important position held by the Blessed Virgin within Irish Christianity, almost from its earliest years, has been the topic of much attention by scholars, and perhaps a formidable achievement of returning Dominicans like Nicholas Lynch was their ability to successfully tap into this resource that was so deeply embedded in the socio-religious psyche of the country's population. A recent historiography on the progress of Counter-Reformation in other parts of Europe has laid a particular emphasis on the centrality of importance of rosary devotion in terms of particular Catholic identity, which is seen as proving decisive for the acceptance of Tridentine reform that such Catholic populations may not have so willingly accepted otherwise. Fray Nicholas Lynch was elected provincial of the Irish Dominican circa 1626 and remained the Irish provincial until 1632. He returned to Lisbon again in the same year. However, he then travelled to Madrid to seek aid from Philip IV for the Dominicans of Ireland. The following year, Fray Nicholas presided over the Portuguese Dominican chapter in June of 1633. He died in Rome the following year and is buried at Minerva. The historian Thomas Flynn has recently described Fray Nicholas as, and I quote, representative of a new breed of confident, energetic and highly competent Irish Dominicans in the 17th century. He, Nicholas Lynch, was an internationalist, thanks in part to the cosmopolitan world of his family and his order, who was as much at home in Lisbon, Salamanca, Rome and Louvain as he was in Galway and Sligo in the west of Ireland. Nicholas Lynch is also seen by the same Flynn as playing a pivotal part in Portuguese Dominican acceptance of Corpus Santo's opening in Lisbon in the 1630s. But just briefly to conclude, in his analysis of the foundation of his own community of Corpus Santo at Este, and that of Bonsucesso and Belyne for the Irish Dominican nuns, as well as that of the Irish College of St. Patrick's, and that of the English Catholic College, all of which were located in Lisbon, a 20th century Irish Dominican and member of the Corpus Santo community for most of his life, argued that his own adopted Portuguese city of Lisbon deserved to be placed on a prestigious pedestal with respect to its benevolence to Irish Catholicism. We, wrote Fray Paul O'Sullivan, know of no other instance where one city alone, like Lisbon, offered 4 such princely edifices, with their appendages and rich endowments to the sufferers. The Catholics of Ireland, he continued, can never repay the debt of generosity they owe to their Portuguese hosts. May the blood of the saints and martyrs, which these foundations have given to the Church, ever make intercession and invoke God's blessing on these good friends. And may the fervent prayers of those who, for 300 years, have found shelter and still find shelter in those spacious homes, call down God's favours on those who so lovingly and so generously received them in their hour of need. End quote. Father Paul O'Sullivan, OP, Sullivan's reference to martyrs might seem to have been made concerning Corpus Santo itself, as his community became known as the Seminary of Martyrs on account of the high number of its alumni that were put to death on account of the religious persecutions in 17th century Ireland. However, I suspect that Fray O'Sullivan may have been referring to a more recent martyrdom as well. Father O'Sullivan wrote these words in 1926. 18 years earlier, however, word came to him when he was a younger friar in Costa Sodre that Carlos I and his son, Louis Felipe, had been shot nearby. Fray Paul O'Sullivan hurriedly made his way to where the king and his son lay, getting the last rites of the church and the Dominican friar's blessing for the dying. Now there's a kind of irony and symmetry to be seen that an Irish Dominican friar anointed the last of the house of Braganza to have ruled Portugal. The diplomatic role played by his 17th century Irish predecessor, Fray Dominico Daly, in the restoration of Portuguese independence under the same house of Braganza is well attested. Friar Daly has been described by his biographer, Margaret McCurtain, as Portugal's ambassador extraordinaire during the restoration of the Portuguese independence from that of the Spanish Habsburgs. Fray Dominico Daly, however, is an example of an Irish friar that stayed on the continent. Friar Nicholas Lynch returned home and brought with him his formative decades spent in Portugal. But to return to Fray Paul O'Sullivan's anointing of Carlos I, however, at its beginning in the mid-17th century as the Royal House of Portugal, no less than when it took its dying breath, the House of Braganza seems intrinsically linked to Irish migrants of Dominican order.